like 410.
Global Final Esperanza.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody. It's so wonderful to be with you. My name is Jeff Hunt, and I have the wonderful privilege of serving as the director of the Centennial Institute at Colorado Christian University and co-chairman of the upcoming Western Conservative Summit. The summit is the largest gathering of conservatives in the Western United States. This year, it'll be June 18th and 19th, 2021. So be sure to save the date. Each month, the Centennial Institute hosts a distinguished lecturer on a variety of topics. Last month, we hosted Dr. Ryan Anderson for a lecture on the ethics of the COVID-19 vaccines. Next month, we'll host Dr. Corey DeAngelis for the lecture, COVID-19 Didn't Break the Public School System. It simply exposed the problems that already existed. Be sure to save the date for that lecture, which will be March 22nd, and you can find more information by visiting our website at centennial.ccu.edu. That's centennial.ccu.edu. As we begin this evening, please join me in welcoming CCU students Madison Manning and Lena Pacifici for a prayer and pledge of allegiance. I'll make sure that they are available to be seen here. Let's get them video up and unmuted. We'll start with Madison. Can you unmute yourself? And
Jeff, I'm unmuted, but it won't let my video come up.
all right, we'll get the video. We'll see if we can get the video started. If not, go ahead and lead us in prayer. There you go. We got you.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeff. Bow your heads with me. God, I just thank you so much for a little bit more warmth in this really cold weather spurt. God, I thank you for Colorado Christian University and Centennial Institute and all the work that they're doing. Lord, I ask that you continue to do work in and through Centennial. God, I ask that you open up all of our eyes tonight to what you have for us, what you want us to hear. Lord, soften our hearts. Lord, teach us and use tonight to just mold and shape how we see the world and how we can be more like you and love more like you. Lord, give Abigail the words to speak and just the words to truly touch our heart. And Lord, I ask for just an abundance of growth and prosperity for her book. Lord, I just pray for provision for our country and for Centennial Institute and all that is going on right now. God, thank you for this opportunity to just learn and to learn how to be more like you and to love like you. Lord, just thank you for tonight. And I just ask that you bless everyone listening. We love you, Lord. Amen.
Amen. Great. Lena, can you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please?
Yes. Please join me for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
Where are they saying the Pledge of
To the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Great. Thank you. And I think we had a question there as to why we do the Pledge of Allegiance. That's we do that at the beginning of every Centennial Institute event. So part of the work that we do. All right. I'm going to make sure we get Abigail started here, and we'll get her unmuted as we read her introduction. So thank you so much to our wonderful CCU students. Switch this off. I'm kind of producer and host here all at the same time. They are just truly wonderful, and God is raising and preparing up these students to be wonderful leaders for our communities. Tonight, I'm proud to welcome Abigail Shrier to discuss her book, Irreversible Damage, the Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. I had a chance to read this book, and I want to thank you, Ms. Shrier, for exploring all the complex issues surrounding transgenderism. Someone who's testified on these issues, you explore in the book, our society is not providing proper analysis on these choices that especially young people are making. The decision to transition will have a lifetime of effects on someone, physically, emotionally, relationally. And you did a fantastic job exploring the complexities of these issues in a thoughtful and loving way. Abigail Shrier is a writer for the Wall Street Journal. She is a graduate of Columbia College, where she received the Uretta Collette Fellowship. She's a graduate of the University of Oxford and Yale Law School. She lives in Los Angeles, California. And if you're watching live on YouTube or Zoom, be sure to ask questions via the chat feature, and I'll relay those at the end of Abigail's lecture. Friends, please welcome the Centennial Institute's February Distinguished Lecturer, Abigail Shrier. Abigail, do we have you?
Yes. Can you hear me?
All right, we got you. All right.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And I want to begin by thanking the Centennial Institute and Colorado Christian University for inviting me to deliver this address. And to those of you who've tuned in, thank you so much for listening. So I've been invited to talk about my book, Irreversible Damage, and I'll do that. But I'm very aware that I'm talking to an audience of mostly college students, and I never forget my audience. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about my book, but I'll spend most of the time talking about what I learned from it. Because most of you probably don't want to be journalists or writers, and even if you do, you're not going to write my book. So I want to share a few things that I learned from the success of the book, because I hope it has lessons for everyone, whether you're headed for a career in medicine or teaching or the ministry or anything else. Okay, so what's the story with the book? I'm a journalist and also a lawyer, and in August of 2018, I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal in which I discussed the laws in New York and California that now assign criminal and civil penalties for failing to use someone's preferred pronouns. I pointed out in the op-ed that these laws are straightforwardly unconstitutional. In America, the government can't force people to say things for any reason at all. This includes, of course, pronouns. The law can't force you to say please and thank you, even though we all agree it's polite to do so, and so too with pronouns. Well, a reader wrote to me, and she told me the following story. She said she was a mom in a terrible situation. Her daughter, a very bright young woman who had a lot of mental health problems, had gone off to college. Though she'd always excelled in school, her daughter had always struggled to fit in, especially with other girls. As a child, she'd always been a girly girl, the mother said. She had boyfriends throughout high school, but she always felt left out of cliques and always was being dropped by female friends. Soon after she arrived at college with a group of girlfriends, she decided that all of her problems coalesced at the point of gender. It was her gender that was the problem. Within a year, she and many of her friends had come out as transgender, and this young woman, who already was being medicated for anxiety, depression, and bipolar II disorder, began a course of testosterone. The woman, her mother, told me that there were parents across the country all witnessing the same thing. Young women with no childhood history of gender dysphoria, that is, the severe discomfort in one's biological sex, but who had a lot of mental health problems, deciding with their friends, often after social media immersion, that they were trans. They were starting courses of testosterone, undergoing voluntary double mastectomies, in an attempt to cure a condition they had self-diagnosed and frankly misdiagnosed as gender dysphoria. I tried to pass this off to an investigative journalist. No one wanted to touch it. But the more I read, the more I learned about the phenomenon, the more I was convinced that it was real. Public health researcher Dr. Lisa Littman, then of Brown University, had done a study on these girls and who were suddenly coming out as trans. See, what was strange about all the girls suddenly coming out as trans is that gender dysphoria actually has a 100-year diagnostic history. It begins in early childhood, ages 2 to 4, and it has always overwhelmingly afflicted boys and men. But in the last decade, out of nowhere and all across the West, the predominant demographic claiming to have gender dysphoria was teenage girls. Dr. Littman hypothesized that this was a social contagion, that is, another instance of teenage girls sharing and spreading their pain. Social contagion is a real phenomenon. There's no question that all human beings have a propensity to copy the behaviors they're exposed to. And adolescent girls are particularly prone to certain kinds of social contagion because of the ways that adolescent girls tend to socialize. Academic psychologists like Amanda Rose have documented this. Adolescent girls tend to ruminate together on their negative emotions, on their pain, and they have a tendency to want to share in their friends' pain. In fact, they are often even willing to suspend reality in order to better support their friends. Oh my God, totally, your boyfriend is a complete sociopath. He's incapable of loving anyone. right? So it's this sort of thing. In some contexts, of course, this is wonderful, and it's why adolescent female friendship is so close and so special. But it's also why social contagions like anorexia can spread so quickly among teen girls. If a teenage boy is feeling depressed, his friends might say, "Let's go play basketball or Xbox." A girl is more likely to say, "Let's talk about it." This is why teenage girls often spread their anorexia to friends. "Oh God, I feel so fat. Do you feel fat? I feel so fat. Totally, I feel so fat." That sort of thing. And we know this to be true. If anorexic girls are housed together on hospital wards without close monitoring, their anorexia will tend to get worse as young women compete to lose more and more weight. Okay, so in my book, I explored whether young women weren't doing the same thing with gender dysphoria. That is, convincing each other that their problem was gender and encouraging each other to transition. And I argued that this seemed to be the case. After all, the dysphoria these girls claimed to have didn't look like traditional gender dysphoria. It came on not in early childhood, as gender dysphoria typically did, but around puberty, when girls naturally feel uncomfortable in their bodies. It seemed to be fueled by social media immersion and watching hours of videos of testimonials and advice by trans influencers. And strangest of all, teen girls were coming out as trans with groups of friends. Within a very short period of time, whole friend groups were transitioning. Now, in the book, I discuss the reasons why this particular social contagion took off, but I was left with absolutely no doubt that the explosive growth of the trans teen girl population was fundamentally connected to peer influence. I interviewed a lot of people: psychiatrists, parents, psychologists, experts in gender dysphoria, endocrinologists, plastic surgeons, adolescents, forensic anthropologists, all kinds of experts, and also a lot of transgender adults. And one of the things I learned from transgender adults was they agreed this didn't look like gender dysphoria at all. The transgender adults I talked to, their gender dysphoria began in early childhood, where they experienced a very severe discomfort in their biological sex. And over the course of years and following therapy, they made a decision to transition. It was a slow process, well considered, something they resisted for many years before giving into it. It wasn't something they were celebrated for or did with friends, and they certainly didn't win adulation for a condition they hadn't wanted. The girls profiled in my book were different. They were celebrated everywhere for this choice. They joined clubs on campus. All their friends suddenly were trans. Being trans had redefined their lives. It was all they wanted to talk about. Fixating on their alleged dysphoria, on their next surgeries, on their next treatments, on their constant oppression, this had become an all-consuming way of life. Often they cut off their families. They demonized cis people and wanted nothing to do with anyone who wasn't an ally or trans. Whatever these girls were seeking, they didn't simply wish to quietly pass as male and lead typical lives of young men. Now you might say, so what? If these girls were merely choosing a transgender identity and leading good, happy lives, I would not have written this book. Personally, I don't care how people identify or what their sexuality is. It's not something that interests me, and I don't really consider it my business. But here was the interesting thing. By all sorts of objective measures, these girls seemed to be doing poorly. By the objective measures, I mean, were they dropping out of school or deciding not to go to college at all? Were they cutting off their families? Did they maintain any of their former friendships? Were they pursuing stable romantic relationships? Were they pursuing careers? Had gender transition helped control their anxiety or depression, or was it raging worse, or were they raging worse than before? Did they maintain hobbies? Had being trans become their entire lives? I found, as a generalization, but an honest one, they weren't doing well at all. And then there were the risks of the medications themselves. I explore these risks in my book. both the dangers of medical transition and what I discovered was a shocking lack of honesty about these risks and a shocking lack of medical oversight. I can go through all the dangers, risks of infertility, sexual dysfunction when cross-sex hormones follow puberty blockers, cardiac arrest, permanent facial and body hair, alteration of facial features, vaginal atrophy, uterine atrophy, endometrial cancer. But the biggest risk of all may just be that we have no idea what the long-term effects of all this testosterone will be on young women. We have never before subjected women to decades of testosterone at 10 to 40 times what their bodies would normally handle. The book is a journalistic investigation of a medical mystery. Why were all these teen girls suddenly deciding they were trans? And why were so many doctors and therapists and teachers going along with it? It contains no policy prescriptions, except that I argue against laws that forbid physicians and therapists from exercising professional judgment. But in the book, I stayed out of politics around transgender issues, and I stayed out of religion. Nonetheless, as you might have heard, the book caused quite a storm. There's a very aggressive activist population that targets anyone who questions the current medical regime that allows patients to self-diagnose with gender dysphoria and obtain treatments on demand. And there's unfortunately a whole medical industry that seems alarmingly unconcerned with the medical risks to a population whose welfare they ought to be safeguarding. For saying this, I've been attacked nonstop for 7 months. Amazon refused to allow my publisher to sponsor ads for the book on the specious grounds that the book was attempting to alter people's sexual orientation. Of course, the book has nothing to do with sexual orientation at all. Target.com pulled the book after one Twitter user claimed it was transphobic, and only after public outcry was the book reinstated. The book is, of course, not transphobic. My interviews have been pulled from YouTube. I've been smeared all over the internet. But here's the thing. The book was wildly successful. Not only did it hit number 10 on Amazon for all books sold, number 10, but it has massive support. A lot of books have been quietly removed from various retailers' offerings with no outcry because so few cared. Check out the Amazon reviews. People really appreciate the book, and it has undoubtedly had a big impact. And now I want to talk to you about why. Because I think this is the most important thing I have to say today, and the thing that is most likely to be of benefit to you. The book succeeded because it had integrity. When you go out into the world, if you want to be successful at anything you choose to do, proceed with integrity. This might be obvious, but it's not. In fact, you would be forgiven for not even knowing what integrity is. We are in the midst of an integrity recession in America. You are coming of age during the worst integrity recession of my lifetime. What is integrity? Generally, integrity refers to being honest and principled, but I think it also means an integration of the way you judge others with the way you judge yourself. An integration of your stated principles with the way you actually operate. The opposite of integrity, of course, is hypocrisy. That's when you claim to believe in certain principles, but in fact you excuse your own failure to live by them because you don't really think they apply to you. You might profess them, but you don't integrate them. If a leftist bookstore, call it Maoist Books, chooses not to carry my book because it only sells books that promote leftist views, that has integrity. You might not agree with that bookstore's mission, but you must admit that a bookstore that lives by its principles has integrity. There is honor in that. Where there is no honor and no integrity is when Amazon, which holds itself out as the world's largest bookstore, actually only allows certain books to be advertised because of an ad hoc policy it selectively enforces. Not only does my book have nothing to do with attempting to convert anyone out of a sexual orientation, you could more easily argue that the hundreds of books that celebrate teen medical transition, for which Amazon allows ads, actually do violate that policy. After all, those books attempt to convince young lesbian girls that they are really heterosexual boys. My book, which only points out the risks without ever opposing medical transition, is content to leave lesbians as they are. The point is, when the world's largest bookstore sneakily acts like Maoist books when it comes to disfavored ideas, that lacks integrity. When a top lawyer for the ACLU calls for my book to be banned, as he did, and no one from the ACLU disavows this view, that organization belies that it has no integrity. After all, the ACLU pretends, right in its title, to be devoted to the protection of civil liberties. That is its stated mission. When the New York Times states that it contains all the news that's fit to print and then fires an editor for publishing a mainstream view by a Republican senator, that belies an organization that has no integrity. When Kirkus Books, which claims to provide an independent pre-publication review of all major published works, and in fact reviews over 10,000 titles per year, including self-published and obscure works, and yet deliberately ignores the best-selling Irreversible Damage for ideological reasons, that belies an organization that lacks integrity. Now, having integrity when you have strong personal or religious commitments can require some additional thoughtfulness. The truth is, you cannot always bring your religious beliefs to bear in every job you do. Sometimes having integrity may mean that you have to recuse yourself. When you take an oath to be objective, or apply the law, or care for your patients or clients, and find that because of a personal or religious commitment you can't faithfully do that, then recusing yourself is what integrity requires. Both Justices Brett Kavanaugh and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, among so many others, endured confirmation hearings under a cloud of suspicion that they would not or could not faithfully apply the Constitution because they are Catholic. It was a bigoted and unfair assumption, but it was also a lie. Both had established long track records of principled application of American law, in spite of religious or personal views that might have led them to wish the law were different from what it is. They survived the confirmation hearings, not because they got lucky or because we had a Republican Senate. They ultimately survived their confirmation hearings because it was true that they had integrity. We knew that they could and would put aside personal views to uphold American law because they had done so. There will be many temptations in life to pursue hidden agendas, even agendas you're certain are right and good. Very often when I am interviewed by conservative media, my interviewers try to get me to link the epidemic of teen trans identification to gay marriage or some other policy that my interviewers oppose. I have never gone along with this for many reasons, but one of the reasons is there's no evidence that this epidemic has anything to do with gay marriage at all. Now, I embrace the legality of same-sex marriage, but even if I opposed it, it still wouldn't have belonged in my book. Why? Because I found no evidence of the connection between the phenomenon I described and legalizing gay marriage. None. And the point of my book was not to promote any political agenda. The book is not a conservative book. It is not a liberal book. It is not a religious book. The book simply sought to investigate a medical mystery and attempt to explain why. Hubris is often described as excessive pride. But another way of thinking about hubris is that it has to do with not knowing what your job is. Hubris is thinking that your actual job is not good enough, that you have this other, more grandiose mission that you ought to be pursuing too. The activist doctors and activist scientists, and they are legion, who promote an agenda of pushing medical transition are not doing their job. Their job is to take care of patients and honestly examine evidence wherever it leads them. When you become a doctor, you take a Hippocratic oath to protect the welfare of your patients, regardless of your political views or agenda. When the New York Times refuses to publish valid opinions it does not like or punishes editors for allowing them into its pages, that's hubris. The New York Times is doing something other than its job. Justices Kavanaugh and Coney Barrett, their job, and they have sworn to do it, is to faithfully apply American law. It is not to protect the unborn or bring about the kingdom of God on earth or promote social justice or dismantle white supremacy or any other agenda, no matter how noble they may deem it. And I think the reason my book was successful was because it didn't try to be more than it was. Now, I happen to be an Orthodox Jew. I'm also a woman and a mother and a lot of other things too. But with the book, I didn't try to advance any of that. All I tried to do was my job. Today, that's a revolutionary thing to do. When you go out into the world, you will undertake many responsibilities. You will become husbands and wives. You'll become mothers and fathers. You'll become doctors, lawyers, and architects. You may be tempted to do something more grandiose than the oaths you have undertaken. But at the end of the day, you'll be far more successful at anything you choose to do if you act with integrity. That is, if you do something much harder than being an activist doctor or activist scientist or activist parent. Do your job. That's it. Do your job. You'll be amazed at how hard and how essential that turns out to be. Thank you.
Abigail, that was wonderful. Thank you. We are getting quite a few questions from folks here on the YouTube channel, and I'll just relay those to you as they come through. So what is the primary age when you see this trend start to begin in young women? Do you see it being a sustainable trend or one that will eventually kind of work its way out? And you kind of get into this with your book, but I'll let you answer and maybe I'll...
Sure. So it comes on in puberty pretty consistently. Obviously that age can vary, but around, sometimes somewhere between 11 and 13, you start to see it. Certainly they start, but it depends. It depends when a young woman, I will say it varies a little bit. And here's how it varies. So it usually comes on around puberty, but that's for girls who've had access to social media. When access to social media is delayed, because social media is a big driver of the phenomenon, then so too is the trans identification. So girls who are very sheltered, who maybe go to college at home, who don't sit on the online all the time, when they finally do go off to college, sometimes that's where they finally, immerse with social media and get a lot of support from peer groups for being trans. So it varies somewhat, but puberty is a typical beginning point. Right. And do I see it continuing? Oh yes, because in America we're not slowing down. So we're not looking at the evidence as they are in England, where they're doing a full review of our current medical practices because so many young women are speaking out and saying that they were rushed to transition that they now regret. That actually caused a bit of a crisis in England, where they actually took a look at the fast track to transition and questioned whether this was helping, and they looked at the evidence. America right now, as it stands, has no interest in the evidence. Our media doesn't cover it. Our scientists aren't, with some very rare exceptions, aren't pursuing it. Many have lost their jobs or have been, canceled in various ways when they've tried. So right now we are an evidence-proof zone in America. So yes, I see it continuing.
And I believe you mentioned in your book too, the eventually you think at some point lawsuits may eventually stem the tide on a medical profession that's kind of rushing into it without really engaging the science. Is that correct?
That seems to be what we respect. I mean, that's how a lot of other crazes finally got under control, right? You think of the repressed memory craze. I mean, there have been a lot of, these phenomena where, all of a sudden a whole group of troubled young women decide this is their problem and they're self-diagnosing and everybody's pushing it. And lawsuits seem to be where the breaks finally come, at least in this country.
Here's another question. In your book, you state how before this trend existed, gender dysphoria was reported among 0.1% of the amount that it is now. How do you respond to those 0.1% kids who are under, who would still suffer from gender dysphoria?
Right. So it was 0.01%. So you're talking about 1 in 10,000 people. So it's far, far smaller than that number. But does it exist? Absolutely. I would never deny it, and I don't deny it. And how would I respond to those kids? Well, I think that, they should be treated for gender dysphoria. Absolutely. Do I have a particular prescription about how their treatment should go? No, I think they would need to be examined by doctors. And frankly, I wouldn't trust a doctor who immediately knew how they should be treated either. Most of the wonderful psychologists and experts I've talked to who have spent years studying gender dysphoria and been experts in it would need to see the child. And some like Ken Zucker in Canada and others have had a lot of success where with what they call watchful waiting, which is giving the child some therapy and letting the child, sort of giving them the freedom to explore what else might be wrong. And very, very often, a large majority of these kids tend to outgrow gender dysphoria. But some of them won't. Some of them will have this their whole lives, and they will, end up being transgender adults.
One thing I really appreciated about your book was it felt like it was a helpful guide for parents whose children are going through this. Can you talk a little bit why you felt like that was important in the book you
Well, you got to tell parents what to do about it. You can't just scare them. That didn't seem very nice.
Yeah, and I felt like you did a good job representing their interests as well. I remember at one point you said, a lot of times these kids are kind of taken into this community and they feel like this is their new family. And you reminded them that parents are still there, that they're the ones who are going to provide for their tuition, that they're providing that roof over their house, that they care and want to guide and direct them. I did appreciate the fact that you kind of represented the parents' interests in the care of their children still.
Well, yeah, I mean, it wasn't supposed to be a judgmental book. Look, I kind of think the last thing the world needs is another parenting book or another book lecturing parents about how they're doing everything wrong. I don't know if there's a more insecure group of parents than my generation of parents. And the reason is we're inundated with experts telling us we're doing everything wrong. And that was not either my goal or something that I thought was correct. These are the parents who called me were incredible people and incredibly devoted parents and also very smart people. I mean, they were doing everything they possibly could for their children and still their daughters were getting caught up in this. So I was, certainly not interested in painting them as, having done something wrong or something, but more in exploring why their daughters were going through this and what we could learn from it.
I also found it interesting on how you pulled in the problems with aggressive pornography these days and how young people are being exposed to sex through pornography that looks very violent and something that they would never want to be a part of. And that may be contributing to their feelings of wanting to transition. Can you respond to that?
Sure. I mean, what we're missing, my generation, I'm part of Gen X. I'm sort of the end of Gen X. And what we grew up with rom-coms. We had romantic comedies. And this generation isn't growing up with rom-coms. But they are growing up with internet porn, which is incredibly violent. In fact, choking is a common category. It's so common across, this wasn't, this was reported in The Atlantic. But it's so common across all categories of Pornhub that they didn't even create a separate category for it. So these are women being choked within an inch of their lives. And 11, 12, 13-year-old girls are seeing this and they're saying, I don't want to be a woman. I don't want this. If this is what sex looks like, I never want to do this. And I definitely don't want it done to me. I want an escape. So yeah, I do, I've talked to also therapists who've said that they've heard adolescents voice a lot of fear about sex based on the internet porn they've seen.
At the beginning of your book, you talk about the generational differences, and you just mentioned it there briefly about how when we grew up, you had romantic comedies and we went to malls with our friends and stuff like that. And kids these days are staying much more at home and spending a lot more time on internet. Can you talk a little bit about the role that generational difference is playing, but then also maybe in a second question, talk about YouTube stars, particularly transgender stars on YouTube that are appealing to young girls?
Sure. So what was the first part before these?
Generational differences.
Oh,
talking to our friends and going to the mall and stuff.
Right. So, others have written about how coddled and isolated young teens are today. Famously, obviously, Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge, both academic psychologists. We're raising a generation of the most isolated, coddled, and really frightened teenagers who are afraid to do almost anything without mom. They spend up to an hour less per day with friends than the previous generation did. And they don't know their own limits. They've never tested them. They've never smoked a cigarette. They never went to the mall and got their ears pierced. So they never made some of the mistakes that previous generations made, but they also never felt free, independent of their parents in the same way. There was no separation between them and mom. And in fact, when they are studied, they even bring mom along when they hang out with their friends. So when they hang out with their friends, they're either on their phone, so they're not really engaging their friends at all. They're not sharing things. They're not feeling better. They're not feeling, a sense of comfort and camaraderie and whatnot because they're both on their phones. But sometimes when they are with their friends, very often they're bringing their mom along. So these are young women who never have the opportunity to feel alive and independent and separate from mom until the moment they say, hey, mom, I think I'm trans. I'm not like you at all. I'm my own person. And all of a sudden, they really get mom's attention with that. And I think it allows them to feel the thing they haven't felt their whole lives, which is this feeling of I'm becoming my own adult person, which is something that adolescents are supposed to strive for. It's just they haven't been given any space to do it. And you asked about the influencers. Yeah. So very often they turn, so instead of friends, because they're not spending time with friends, when they have a question about their sexuality, their life, their looks, anything about how they're feeling, they don't ask their girlfriends anymore. They actually go online and look, they Google their questions, or they go and they start following social media influencers and including trans influencers who are very upbeat. Their videos are fun to watch. There are truly numberless, videos. They're really well produced, but they tell you all the great things you're going to feel if you start testosterone, how it's the greatest thing that ever happened to them. And they're going to tell you that if you ever feel uncomfortable in your body, maybe you're not a girl, maybe you're a boy, maybe you're something else. And they encourage you and valorize trying out, the opposite sex, and they minimize the risks because they're not aware of them, maybe, or they're certainly not doctors, but they minimize the risks of these hormonal treatments like testosterone. And frankly, they don't always necessarily care about those risks either, because of course they're teenagers. The influencers are usually in their early 20s, but it's sort of the same mindset. So.
And you got a chance to interview some of them. What was that like to get to know some of these YouTube influencers?
It was great. It was a good experience. I always love talking to people as a journalist. And I liked it because, I had heard from parents that internet influencers, they basically considered them, many of the parents who talked to me basically considered them drug dealers. They were considered them the worst influence in their children's lives. And I really wanted to know from their perspective, how did they understand what they were doing? How did they see it? What were their goals? And so that's what I got to hear about, and it really did change my perspective. I started to think that some of the influencers were far more well-meaning than others, and sort of had, you know, their hearts in the right place, if not always the best advice.
We're getting lots of questions, which is great. Trying to keep up here. One person you did interview with was Joe Rogan. He has quite a bit of fame and following. How did that interview experience go for you?
It was great. It was a great time. He was tough, as he often is, and it was a serious interview, but I thought very fair and very serious. And I think that, you know, he's someone with a wide-ranging curiosity and intellectual drive, which makes for a really fun interview experience. So it was a good experience, and I really enjoyed it.
Were you nervous at all?
Sure, but you know, I looking back, I think maybe I should have been more nervous than I was. But yes, I was.
We do have a really powerful question here from someone who did transition and then detransitioned. And I feel like your book actually provides an important spotlight on that audience, that community that often is ignored because they don't fit in with a particular political agenda. Can you talk about the conversations, the relationship you had with those that had detransitioned?
Oh, it was a really good experience getting to know those young women. I didn't, and frankly, I also talked to some biological men who had detransitioned. I always learned a lot from them. These are people who are, they've been through a tremendous amount, and so they have far more wisdom and maturity than the average person you talk to. Some of them were absolutely brilliant, and I think that it really took a certain level of thoughtfulness to work their way out of the ideology they had been trapped in, you know, at least according to their testimonies. And so what they had to say was fascinating. And, you know, whatever doesn't kill us makes us stronger. I mean, these were very strong and very, I think, very, very thoughtful young people who I've been, you know, very grateful to know.
And one of the aspects that you pointed up was there's a website, maybe it's for parents, maybe it's for those that detransitioned, but where this conversation can happen. People can connect with others, either other parents or people that have detransitioned before. I don't quite remember the name of the website, but can you talk a little bit about that community?
Sure. So there are a few websites that parents have gone to. I really like Parents of ROGD Kids. From what I understand, there are a lot of wonderful parents who found, you know, a lot of help and support through that website. Fourth Wave Now has published some wonderful pieces by detransitioners and others that really helps people unpack what all this is about, what this phenomenon is about. So those would be the first two I would start with. Transgender Trend is another great group. They're out of the UK though.
You hinted at this with your aspect on integrity, and we spoke about it with Dr. Ryan Anderson last month when we got into the ethics of vaccines. And part of the problem that I think people really have that is being driven in part by the transgender worldview is people are starting to develop a lack of trust in science because it feels like a lot of science is agenda driven, that they won't look at the facts, that they're more driven by a political narrative than the truth. And it seems like this issue is part of that. Can you talk about how we can restore trust back into science?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I put it in terms of this integrity recession or integrity crisis, but it's real. It's really real. I mean, look, any doctor or therapist or scientist I talk to, and I ask them what their politics are, they respond with, it doesn't matter. Because your politics, your political agenda should be, you know, your political desires, whatever you want in terms of policy should be irrelevant to the way you practice medicine or follow evidence or how you evaluate a condition. But unfortunately, and it is very much generational, we are now seeing a young generation of doctors and scientists who are activists first and doctors or scientists second. It's a major problem. Okay, when you talk to them, they start with the conclusions. The only question for them is how to get there. They don't start from the evidence, they start from the conclusions. And that's what affirmative care is about. It's about starting with, okay, I know you're trans because you say you are. I know you must have gender dysphoria. The only question is, how much medication do I give you? That's not how medicine has ever proceeded before, and it really isn't how science or medicine ought to proceed. Because if even for one patient, the treatment or diagnosis is inappropriate, you would want a doctor or scientist to be open to seeing that and acknowledging it. And unfortunately, with this young generation of doctors and activist doctors and scientists, of which there are far too many in America, they're not open to that.
And one example you give is that some folks are walking into counseling sessions and that day walking out with testosterone. I even mentioned a few colleges where that could happen. What is the problem with that? What are the complications with just handing people pharmaceuticals like that upon a single consultation?
Well, of course, because they're not doctors themselves, right? You go to a doctor, so you say to your doctor, my shoulder hurts or my tooth hurts. I think you should take it out. And you want a doctor or dentist or medical professional to say, hold on, I know you think it's that tooth, but actually that's hurting you. But actually I've done an x-ray and it seems to be this other tooth that's the problem. The reason they went to medical school was so that they could exercise their medical judgment. And in the area of transgender medicine, unfortunately, much like during the opioid crisis, when patients were just showing up saying, I've got pain, give me, Dilaudid or whatever they wanted, patients are showing up saying, I have gender dysphoria, give me the testosterone. And they're walking out that day after an hour visit at most. And that's happening across the country. It's happening at different ages, depending on the state. In Oregon, at 15, you don't even need your parents' permission for this. And, that's a crisis in and of itself. You don't want patients self-diagnosing. That's why we have doctors in the first place.
One question we have here from folks is, do you know what the rate of detransition is out of the amount of people that begin transitioning?
I don't know. It's very, very hard number to get. It's very hard for many reasons, and I'll tell you why. First of all, it seems to be large. And the reason it seems to be large is if you look on social media and the the detransitioners groups, they've grown shockingly. So when I wrote my book, there was already 7,000 members of the subreddit called Detrans. Okay, now this is not just detransitioners, but it's mostly detransitioners. And I guess 9 months later, it was 17,000 members. So you see numbers that are growing. But there are a lot of reasons that we don't know exact numbers on detransition. We don't know what numbers because, first of all, there's actually no code for detransitioner the way there is detrans the way there is for other mental health conditions, desistance. So there's no way for the practitioner to record the doctor to record someone who has stopped having the condition gender dysphoria. But there's something else too. When someone detransitions and wants to go off their medication, they almost never go back to their original doctor. Why? Because they swore up and down to that endocrinologist, I know what I have, I'm gender dysphoric, I've always been transgender, trust me, give me the medication. They don't want to go back to that person and admit, actually, I was going through a really hard time. I know I promised you I was definitely trans, but I think the whole thing was a mistake. So most often, detransitioners don't go back to the original doctor. So we don't have easy ways of keeping up with the numbers on this, but it does seem to be a very fast-growing population. And given the ease with which young teen girls are able to start testosterone, and how many other mental health problems these young women have, it seems to be fair to assume that we're going to see a whole lot more of regret and a whole lot more of detransition.
Mm. One of the parts that was enlightening in your book was you talk about the stages that someone will go through oftentimes when they're transitioning, that they don't just jump right into full body surgeries when it comes to transitioning. They'll oftentimes take smaller steps on their way in that direction. Can you talk about the different steps that someone may go through? And then my follow-up question would that be, you seem to be warning parents that even some of the smaller steps can be problematic.
That's a good question. So the typical story is my daughter turned 13. She decided she was a lesbian. She announced she was a lesbian. We were really supportive. Then she cut her hair short and started wearing more mannish clothes. She joined the Gay Straight Alliance in high school. Within a year or two, she decided, actually, I'm pansexual. Within a year or two, and then in 4 years short order, no, I'm not pansexual, now I'm trans. And the moment they start declaring trans, they start pushing for testosterone and surgeries because, of course, they don't look like boys. So if you're going to say you're a trans boy or trans man and you look exactly like a girl, it's not very convincing. So there's a lot of social pressure to sort of prove it and really commit by starting testosterone and surgeries, top surgery, and these things are very easy to get with a parent cooperation and approval. You can get them at very young ages. In California, 13. I mean, very, very young ages. Okay, so why are these signs that we might think of as no big deal really significant? Because when a 11, 12, 13-year-old who has zero romantic experience or sexual experience and decides she's suddenly pansexual, she probably doesn't know what she actually is. After all, she's had almost no experience with other people. She's been far, far more isolated, and other people, I actually mean her peers, far less experience with her peers in a romantic setting or any kind of, being alone away from parents than previous generations. And we know this, that teens today are having far less sex and even far less romantic relationships and even less sexual touching than previous generations. So this is a generation that isn't likely to know who they are. And yet the moment they announced, I'm a pansexual on social media, which girls are doing very young, they get tons of adulation and encouragement. So these are young women who are lonely, who are not fitting in with their peers very often. And the moment they do this, they're the life of the party. They're popular. One of the things that Dr. Littman found in her study was that all the parents said that the young girl's popularity increased as soon as she announced a trans identity or non-binary identity, this sort of thing. And what was significant to the parents, and these were overwhelmingly progressive parents politically, but what was surprising to the parents is, of course, they were sort of two minds about it a little bit because, and certainly with the parents I interviewed, because they really wanted their daughters to have friends. And all of a sudden they were watching their daughters get a lot of attention and praise and even friendship. So I think that taking your daughter's sexual announcements at an age when she can't possibly know, and more importantly, making a public proclamation about this is probably not the right way to handle it. So what I mean by that is, your daughter says at 15 she's pansexual. Don't let her put that on social media. Don't let her announce to thousands of adults who may want to take advantage that she's got this new sexuality that they might be interested in. It doesn't belong in front of the eyes of thousands or millions of strangers. But more importantly, you're locking her into an identity that might more naturally evolve and change over time as she grows in experience. Why would these girls, once they announce the identity and make it public, especially on social media, they tend to feel completely locked into it. They feel ashamed to go back on it. And that's just not a situation you want your daughter in.
That's very helpful advice for parents trying to navigate a lot of challenges with social media. You mentioned, or recently you wrote in the Wall Street Journal about how this is going to affect women's sports. Can you give us some insight on your perspective regarding that and some of the changes we may see through the Biden administration?
Sure. So for the Wall Street Journal, I wrote specifically on the Biden Gender Identity Executive Order. And the Biden Gender Identity Executive Order specifically directed schools to begin allowing, sports teams to be opened based on, it said that sports teams couldn't discriminate on the basis of gender, but what that means is a girls' sports team can't discriminate, meaning can't say no to biological boys. And of course, what this means in practical terms is that every public high school in America, virtually every public high school takes federal funds. So they now have a warning that if they don't go along with this and allow biological boys on the girls' teams, they could lose all federal funding. That's a really big deal for a lot of these schools. I mean, some of these schools are just funded through, they have a lunch program that comes from the federal government. So virtually every public high school gets these funds. And this seems to be something the Biden administration is very committed to pursuing, certainly since this executive order came on day one. It's a disastrous policy for girls' sports for many reasons I can go into, but basically because of the organizational effects that occur after male puberty, that there are permanent changes to young men's bodies that create an unbridgeable gap in athletic prowess between biological boys and even women that is permanent and unbridgeable, even if those young biological men later reduce the level of hormones in their bodies, currently circulating in their bodies. It doesn't diminish, or it doesn't substantially diminish, the organizational effects of testosterone.
So we're going to see, in your mind, an unfair playing field when it comes to women's sports. I mean, there's some that have out there that have said that this is the end of women's sports. How do you see us through this process?
No, it's the end of women's sports. If Americans decide that they're not brave enough to stand up, it's the end. I mean, I could give you a number of examples, but the one that I typically reach for is Allison Felix, who ran the 400 meter in 49.26 seconds, and as of 2018, nearly 300 high school boys could beat her. So that means we're talking about a world in which an Olympic runner, Allison Felix, who has more gold medals than any runner, including Usain Bolt. Okay, she has good claim to being the most accomplished female sprinter in U.S. history. She never makes it onto the team because that's how many high school boys can beat her. Okay, so what we're talking about, not the top number 1, 2, and 3 in girls' sports. We're talking about the top 100, 200, 300 female athletes, depending on the sport. Venus and Serena Williams once famously challenged a tennis player, a male tennis player. They said they could beat any male tennis player out of the top 200. So I think number 203 challenged them, and he destroyed them. So this is the 203rd best tennis player, and he easily beat Serena and Venus Williams. We're really talking about destroying women's sports, completely erratic, a major cutback on Title IX, and really losing all those opportunities young women won. And if Americans prove unserious about defending their girls, we're about to lose all those rights.
One comment here, people are very glad that this is a reasonable discussion about sexuality that's happening here in America. So we're getting some very good feedback here. Abigail, one of the questions that came in has to do with curriculum when it comes to public education. Do you see a problem with some of the comprehensive sex education curriculum continuing to encourage this type of transitioning?
So I do. I think it's a major problem, but I think that, and I say this as someone who has investigated, who's done a very thorough investigation of the California public school curriculum specifically. I've also been sent materials from other public school systems, but I have, thoroughly investigated both meetings of the California Teachers Association, which is the largest public teachers union in California, but also the curricula. Look at their various sex ed and what they call the SOGI curriculum, sexual orientation and gender identity. And I would say that not only is much of this curriculum so radical, extreme, and really designed to confuse that parents have no idea what's going on. They're so far behind that the best remedy is really to get your kid out of public school. In California, they designed the new curriculum and the new, what they call the framework here, so that parents are not allowed to opt out of the sexual orientation and gender identity curriculum. You see, they're allowed to opt out of sex ed, so they put it into a different curriculum. So parents were busy opting out of sex ed. Meanwhile, arguably the most confusing thing to adolescents was the curriculum that wasn't opt-outable, that encouraged their kids, in fact, instructed them that if they thought they might not be a boy, they probably weren't. Only they know their true gender. This is the sort of thing that can be very confusing to children, especially if it's repeated over and over and over, and especially if, they reach a time in their lives when they're going through something hard and they feel uncomfortable in their bodies because they've just hit puberty and no boys like them, and they think, oh my gosh, I know what this is. I'm a boy.
One question we got here from a student. I have many friends who insist that the only reason young women in transition aren't doing well academically and in other ways is because societal opposition and transphobia. What would be your response to that?
My response would be, but we've never had less societal opposition than we have today. We've never had less transphobia, right? This should be a heyday of transgender identification, right? Or a heyday of transgender life. There's never been more celebration from Hollywood. There's never been more in public school. If you come out of transgender, and many private schools, they actually keep it from your parents. So you don't even have to worry about parental opposition. It is talk to anyone in college. It has never been more popular. Now, does that mean that I don't believe that harassment and transphobia and other harassment exists? Of course it does. I'm sure there is transphobia, and I'm sure that there are girls who are harassed and feel bad and made to feel bad because of this. Okay, but a couple of things. One, that doesn't prove that transition will cure the problem of suicidality. We have had no long-term studies that show that transition cures the suicidality and suicidal ideation in this population. So is suicidal ideation the result of harassment or transphobia? It might be. It certainly might be, but why is so much suicidal ideation spiking now when we have the most accepting society we've had to transgender people? Why today?
What would be your advice to a college student that has a friend who's going through gender dysphoria?
Well, are we talking about gender dysphoria, meaning the real thing that came on in childhood, and so they've been suffering, for a long time and have, or what are we, or the copycat phenomenon that I describe? I mean, they both sort of may look like gender dysphoria. They both claim to be gender dysphoria, but one is real. And the other is more of a copycat phenomenon. But the broader thing I would suggest is, of course, you must treat everyone with decency and kindness. It's nobody's job to make, to either point out that they might not have the real thing, or to make anyone ever feel bad about anything they're going through and who they are. So I think if someone's going through this, I talk about it in my book. I talk about what it might be. There are a lot of wonderful videos of detransitioners online they can find, that young women who thought they were sure they were trans until they realized that, actually they weren't. So some of those videos people find very, very helpful. But certainly bottom line is, I wouldn't want anyone to make anyone feel bad about, whatever identification they choose.
That's very helpful. As we get ready to kind of wrap up here, you've talked about the importance of integrity, of the challenges you faced because of kind of activist-oriented publications, of activist-oriented books, stores that aren't supposed to be activist-oriented, and kind of the creep that's coming into this integrity. As you kind of have some final parting words for our students and for the general public, we have a number of students on here, but we have a few hundred that are watching online right now. Can you give us just kind of your closing statements and parting words to both our audiences?
I think we have an integrity crisis, but also an objectivity crisis. There is something called objectivity. It's really important, right? There is something where facts actually exist, and we need evidence to support, and evidence lends itself to, certain conclusions and leans in the other direction from others. And maintaining a faith that objectivity is something that exists, that we should all strive for, is really important. Because the moment that we lose that, I think we just all become this, we just get swallowed in competing emotions and a lot of screaming. And just remembering that objectivity is something we all should be able to access, and evaluate with, or access, and we all should be able to evaluate evidence. There's nothing unkind about examining evidence. There's nothing cruel about asking to see what someone's proof of something is. That's actually what your job is in life, is to evaluate claims for yourself and see if you agree with them. And that's not an unkind thing to do. It's just taking your responsibilities as an adult seriously.
That's great. Towards the end of the book, you kind of have some parting words for the young girls that you're writing about. I felt like that was very, very important. I want to make sure we cover that as we close here today, that you encourage these young girls to make sure they maintain a relationship with their parents, that they call their parents, that they don't forget their parents. Can you kind of give us a review of your closing words to both the parents and to these young girls?
Well, I would just say that, look, first of all, being a woman is a wonderful thing to be. Unfortunately, too few people have told young women this today, but it actually is. I know we're so we're enamored of this competition to become an ever greater victim, but women are not victims. And you always have choices in life, and you actually have a lot more control over your own life than you may realize. Now, of course, staying connected to your parents does not mean, being attached at the hip, and it doesn't mean not forming your own adult decisions or pursuing your own adult life. But I do think, at the end of the day, I watched a lot of young women, vicariously, through interviewing, go through a really, really rough road. And I can tell you that the only ones who were there for them at the very end, were not the teachers who encouraged their transition, not the psychologists who told them it was very brave, not the endocrinologists who immediately put them on hormones, but the parents who were there to pick up the pieces. And at the end of the day, that is who's there for them.
Wow. That's a wonderful way to finish. Ms. Shrier, I want to thank you so very much for your time this evening. Thank you to your husband and kids for letting us take you away a little bit this evening. I think you've been wonderful for our students and for the general public, and I just want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Well, for all of you joining us, I want to thank you for taking the time to be a part of the Centennial Institute's February 2021 Distinguished Lecture Series. If you're looking for that next step in your professional career, check out all the great degrees offered by Colorado Christian University. We are committed to God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, to the Church, to the Bible, and to honoring Christ in all we do. You can learn more by visiting ccu.edu. That's ccu.edu. A reminder to join us next month on March 22nd as we host Dr. Corey DeAngelis on his lecture, COVID-19 didn't break the public school system. It simply exposed the problems that already existed. And be sure to save the date for the Western Conservative Summit, June 18th and 19th, 2021. Thank you all, and God bless you all.